My name is Gary Campbell. My speech today is about Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, and I think it failed. My research on this controversial subject has shown me that Keynesian economics, government worker programs, and higher taxes will not lower large unemployment or stimulate the economy in a country. Today I will address the proven historical facts to support my conclusion. Was it the New Deal or the Raw Deal? That, of course, depended on where you stood at the time economically. Unemployment at the end of 1939 remained at Depression levels. In May 1939, Treasury Secretary Henry J. Morgenthau Jr., one of Franklin Roosevelt's best friends, testified before the House Ways and Means Committee, and he said, "I say, after 8 years of this administration, we have just as much unemployment as when we started, and an enormous debt to boot." When he spoke, unemployment exceeded 20%. The beginning of World War II did not fully end the Depression. It is true enough that unemployment ended, but this was only because of the draft of World War II. Had it not been for the huge growth in the military by the millions, there is every reason to think that Roosevelt would have continued to struggle with unemployment. Roosevelt only reluctantly embraced the Keynesian prescription of increased public spending. Roosevelt did indeed spend a great deal on government programs, but this must be balanced against his tax increases. Spending by the government does not add to employment, since taxes displace private spending and investing. Every dollar of government spending must be raised through a dollar of taxation. If the WPA built a $10 million bridge, for example, the bridge has to be paid out of taxes. For every public job created by the bridge project, a private job was destroyed somewhere else. All that has happened at best is that there has been a diversion of jobs because of the project. Keynesians, of course, have a response ready. They will say that investors, owing to pessimism about the future, would not have spent on their own the money the government takes in taxes. Instead, they would have hoarded it. Had the money remained in private hands, the increase in employment would have been less than what occurred under the beneficent auspices of Washington. If businessmen were reluctant to invest, precisely the anti-business attitude of the Roosevelt administration was in large part responsible. Roosevelt supported confiscatory rates of taxation. Small wonder then that investors were reluctant to embark on new projects. They had good reason to think that if they were to be successful, Roosevelt would grab their profits for his own dubious schemes. In fact, the New Deal programs were financed in large part by the poor. At Roosevelt's behest, excise taxes were imposed on many pauper items of consumption, and these weighed especially heavy on the impoverished. In the first 4 years of Roosevelt's presidency, revenue from excise taxes exceeded that of income and corporate taxes combined. I do not think it right, though, to call excise taxes regressive. Everyone paid the same rate. The poor were not charged more. This was far from the only deal in which New Deal programs hurt the poor. Blacks fared very badly under Roosevelt, the supposed great exemplar of enlightened modern liberalism. Minimum wage laws proved a stumbling block to efforts by blacks to secure jobs. These laws prevented employers from undercutting unions by offering lower wages to non-union members. Since blacks faced exclusion from many of the powerful unions, they were in fact frozen out. Roosevelt, by the way, allowed unions freely to violate private property rights with sit-down strikes. The forcible seizure and occupation of an employer's property were, for Roosevelt, quite in order. Roosevelt was not much concerned with the effects of his program on blacks. Indeed, he did little, I mean little, to support civil rights. For example, he would not support anti-lynching legislation that at that time was going through the Congress. To do so, he might antagonize certain important Southern congressmen. Despite his seeming indifference to blacks, Roosevelt gained support among many members of the black community, in part owing to carefully calibrated publicity gestures by members of his administration. Nevertheless, several prominent blacks did see through him. Roosevelt snubbed Jesse Owens after he triumphed at the 1936 Berlin Olympic Games, and thereafter Owens campaigned against him. Roosevelt also had a thirst for power. Though the 1936 elections gave the Democrats overwhelming control of Congress, this was not enough for Roosevelt. He sought to purge those who were not fully behind his program. In particular, he could not forgive those who dared to oppose his unsuccessful proposal to pack the Supreme Court. Roosevelt's quest for power and disdain for criticism had a very sinister side. He used government agencies, especially the FBI and the IRS, to harass his political opponents. Thus, at the president's instigation, a case of tax evasion against former Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon was pursued. Robert Jackson, who ordered the prosecution of Mellon, was later elevated to the Supreme Court as payback for his efforts. Mellon was eventually vindicated of these charges. As soon as Jesse Owens and Joe Louis criticized Roosevelt, IRS investigations of them commenced. As I have stated, unemployment at the end of 1939 remained at Depression levels. It had not been lowered. Unemployment in America was fixed due to the huge military draft of World War II, when millions of Americans put on our country's uniform to fight after 1939. The national debt had grown substantially by 1939 from Depression levels. The black community of this country suffered greatly due to the New Deal. The poor of this country did not see any relief from the New Deal. They were just as poor by 1939 as they were during the Depression. We were introduced to the largest personal and business income tax increases in the history of this country by 1939. Surcharges on necessities were at an all-time high by 1939. Big government grew more than at any other time in our country's history. It did not fix our economy. Our economy recovered after World War II as we found ourselves the only major superpower on the earth that had not suffered devastating destruction from World War II. It was not a new deal or a good deal, but was a raw deal for most of America.